Today I'm going to show you how you can use an undesigned coincidence between Acts and something that is in the New Testament and presents itself as a Pauline epistle to support both the reliability of Acts and the authorship of that epistle by Paul at the same time without circularity. Now this might seem like a little bit of a trick. Why might it seem that it's circular to use an undesigned coincidence to support both of those things at the same time? Well, you might think, well, you're using Acts and material in Acts to support the authorship of this epistle by Paul, and you're using this epistle that says it's by Paul to support the reliability of Acts. So isn't that somehow a loop or circular? And I'm going to show you how you can do that without it being a loop, without it being circular. You may have noticed last time when I did all of those amazing coincidences between Acts and the Pauline epistles, I mostly emphasized their impact on our assessment of the reliability of Acts. And I also mentioned in passing that the epistles I was using, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Romans, are universally acknowledged to be Pauline. Even Bart Ehrman acknowledges that they're Pauline. So I didn't emphasize that it's also relevant to the Pauline authorship. And yet at the same time, if you follow my work, you know that I don't think that we should be bound to what scholars acknowledge. I think a lot of times scholars refuse to acknowledge things that they should acknowledge, such as, in this case, for this video, the Pauline authorship of 2 Timothy. But suppose you're just approaching this, it's kind of new to you. You might be wondering, can I use these undesigned coincidences as evidence for Pauline authorship and also evidence for Acts? Don't I have to go out and establish one of those things completely separately first? Now, in theory of knowledge epistemology, if you do it right, the order that you do it in shouldn't matter. Some orders are more intuitive and can help to prevent us from making mistakes. But in the end, if you're really doing it just right, if you get this piece of evidence before that piece of evidence, it shouldn't matter. You should take all the dependencies into account, and you should come to the same credibility in the end. But suppose you haven't investigated the authorship of the pastoral epistles, as they're called, for 2 Corinthians and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and you're like, well, I know that scholars say they weren't really written by Paul, so I guess I shouldn't use that to support the reliability of Acts. So I'm going to show you that's not the case. So I'm going to start with a relatively simple undesigned coincidence. This is in Paley. This is in my book, Hidden in Plain View. Eric Manning has recently mentioned it on his channel, Testify. And it starts with Acts chapter 16. I did have this open ahead of time, but evidently I had it open at the wrong spot. Acts 16, beginning at verse 1, and he came also to Derbe and to Lystra, that's Paul. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman, who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him, because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Okay, so saying that Timothy's mother was a Jewish woman, and it says a believer. I think that pretty clearly means a Christian believer. And his father was a Greek, and I think that just means his father was a pagan and was not a believer at all. And he had not been circumcised. Presumably his father had not wanted him to be circumcised, but now he was a young adult. And in Jewish law, this is from biblical times to now, from a rabbinic perspective, if your mother is a Jew, you're considered to be a Jew. And so technically, Timothy would have been considered to be a Jew. We find that in Paul's letters, he's very opposed to the idea that Gentile believers have to be circumcised, and he's not necessarily saying that Timothy would have had to be. But because Timothy was considered a Jew, and they're going to be ministering and evangelizing, among others, to Jews, he decides to asks Timothy to be circumcised. Okay, so now we go over to 2 Timothy. You know, I started this video before and I had to re-record it, and the flipping around worked a lot better that time. Anyway, all right, 2 Timothy 1:5. For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well. So it says it was written by Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, supposedly writing to Timothy. That's how it presents itself. And he attributes Timothy's religious upbringing and his sincere faith to his female relatives, his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. Now, if we also look at 2 Timothy 3:15, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. All right, so he's saying that he's been taught the sacred writings from childhood, and I think that would definitely mean, and scholars agree with me here, the Old Testament, that Timothy was given. In other words, a Jewish upbringing where he was taught to accept and have reverence for the Old Testament scriptures, but then he's also said to have received his sincere faith from his grandmother and his mother, and then their names are given. So from this we get a unified picture of Timothy, that he is, if we put these items of information together, notice there's this absence of his father in 2 Timothy. And we could conjecture a variety of things. We might conjecture that his father was dead, or we might conjecture that his father was a pagan, that he was not Jewish, because it's kind of unusual for a boy to be given a Jewish upbringing, being taught the Jewish scriptures and being given his religious upbringing and training by his female relatives, and no mention of his father. So was his father dead, or was his father not Jewish, or what? Raises a question. Acts explains this by the statement that that Timothy's mother was Jewish, but his father was a Greek. Okay, no mention of his grandmother there, and no mention of the names of the mother or the grandmother. Now, there are numerous items of independence, information showing the independence of Acts from 2 Timothy, that Acts is not based on 2 Timothy, and 2 Timothy is not based on Acts. I was just reviewing some of these today as I was thinking through something, and I was reading yesterday, again, the section in Paley's Horai Pauline, which again is completely free, on 2 Timothy. He's got some great items there, and I don't want to take time to go into detail about all of them. But the independence is just evident, because when you look at the mentions of people like Trophimus and Erastus, and places like Miletus and Troas in 2 Timothy, it does not fit into the Roman imprisonment of Paul in Acts, at the end of Acts. But he's clearly in prison, and says, or that he's in prison, or if someone was faking it, the person is faking being Paul in prison in Rome. So the way that 2 Timothy refers to all these things, they just don't fit. So just to name one, he says he left Trophimus sick at Miletus. But when he makes his journeys in Acts, Trophimus is actually with him. You know, they go through Miletus, and then they eventually go to Jerusalem, and then after that he's captured, and eventually he ends up in Rome. He doesn't get back to Miletus any other time, and Trophimus is with him all the way to Jerusalem, because it mentions that the Jews thought he'd brought Trophimus into the temple, and Trophimus was a Gentile, and that's part of why they rioted. So he didn't leave Trophimus at Miletus sick. Now, that's not a contradiction unless you're trying to fit it into that journey, but it doesn't fit into that journey. And Paley argues, I think forcefully, I don't think there's really any good way to doubt this, that Paul's imprisonment, or the imprisonment referred to in 2 Timothy, is a different imprisonment in Rome, not the one referred to in Acts. And when you take that supposition, a lot of other things fall into place, not just some kind of ad hoc, oh gee, I have to try to avoid contradiction. It's actually an excellent explanation of many things that we find in those 3 pastoral epistles, which were clearly written around the same time, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And I could mention a lot of things, like his saying he left his cloak at Troas and so forth. If the author of those pastoral epistles was was basing it on Acts and trying to pretend to be Paul when he really wasn't Paul, he would have, I think, tried to make references that would fit into the journeys in Acts, to the people and the places, and it just doesn't. And on the other side, Acts doesn't look like it was based on 2 Timothy for those same reasons, that lack of fit, as well as the failure to refer to the grandmother, or, if you're going to grab stuff from 2 Timothy and say, hey, I'm going to use this to beef up my picture of Timothy, then why not, put in his name? Acts gives lots of names. Why not put in the names Eunice and Lois? If you're going to refer to his mother, you might as well give her name if you're taking that from 2 Timothy. So there's lots of evidence that the authors of these 2 documents were not basing their documents on each other. So our picture of Timothy, which is a unified picture where Acts is explaining that strange reference to his female relatives in the absence of his father, appears to be coming from 2 different sources that had independent ideas about Timothy. Okay, so that's an undesigned coincidence. The one book explains the other, but they don't appear to be based on each other. How does this address the circularity question? Now, there's going to be a graphic that's going to go with this video, but unlike in a previous case, which I will link in the show notes, where I talked about mutual support and the Gospels, I'm not going to try to hold up my graphic to the camera. I'm going to make a Google Doc link. I'm going to make it public. I'm going to put it in the show notes, and you can go and you can look at that Google Doc at your leisure. What we have here are what epistemologists, especially formal epistemologists, like to call exogenous inputs or external inputs. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't have to use anything from 2 Timothy to note simply how Acts presents itself and what Acts says. And you don't have to use anything from Acts to note how 2 Timothy presents itself and what it says, the content. Okay? Those are independent inputs. We're not assuming anything about Acts simply to say this is what 2 Timothy says, and this is what it presents itself as. It presents itself as a letter written by Paul to Timothy. And here we have the input from Acts. Acts has those we passages where it presents itself as written by a companion of Paul. It presents itself as written by a person who's careful, who's followed things from the beginning. You've got that introduction to Luke, introduction to Acts. That's how it presents itself, at least. And then you've got its contents, okay, about the journeys and what it says about Timothy. So those are separate inputs. Those set up what we call lines of support. My husband and I we really sweated on this, on an article way back in 2008 in the technical journal Architectus on mutual support and how mutual support can be carried out without any loops. and we eschew, we reject all talk of, benign loops, or if the loop's big enough, it doesn't matter. We're what is called foundationalists, and no loops are allowed. And we argued in that article that properly understood, mutual support is possible without any line looping. So you start with these lines of support that come from these separate inputs that are just how the books present themselves and what they say. And those lines go like this, and then they support an intermediate proposition, which is a conjunction. Here's our unified picture of Timothy, which appears to be true, and which I think we should take to be true, that these things are actually true about Timothy. Why? Because of the way that these self-presentations and these statements, these contents, interlock. So we note that interlocking, and then that other evidence that appears to show that they're independent, such as I've just been laying out, like the difficulty of fitting 2 Timothy into any of the journeys in Acts, which fraudulent writers would have been motivated to eliminate. And you note all of that. I don't try to represent every piece of this in the graphic, by the way. The graphic would have gotten too crowded. But because of all of this, we are justified in thinking that this picture of Timothy is actually true. And we're also justified in thinking that the authors have independent sources of information about Timothy without relying on one another. So true, we are justified in believing that this is a true picture of Timothy, and that it comes from independent, accurate sources of information. That's an intermediate proposition. Then we go up from there, and the apex of this particular diagram then is a conjunction. And the conjunction is that Acts and 2 Timothy are what they claim to be. That they really are written by people close to the facts, that 2 Timothy really was written by Paul, and that Acts really was written by a companion of Paul who's careful about his facts. That's at the apex. Now, am I saying that this one argument is like all you need to accept that apex proposition? No, this is just one argument. And this one argument is part of a larger cumulative case. So, for example, last time I gave you all of that evidence for the reliability of Acts. But within this one argument, this is the proper diagram of its, or at least one proper way to diagram its force, and the way that those two different lines of evidence converge and they go up and they support these conjunctions, and never do those lines loop. Neither of those lines loops back to those ultimate nodes down here. And the ultimate nodes are sort of what we might call the engine, the driver, that are these exogenous inputs. And when you put them together and you consider their epistemic impact correctly, you get justification for these conjunctions, the intermediate conjunction concerning the truth of the picture of Timothy. And then, if these authors really know these things about Timothy, then that's some reason to believe that they, and they know them independently, that's some reason to believe that they are who they claim to be. So that's a relatively quick way of explaining how you can argue from an undesigned coincidence for authorship and for the reliability of Acts at the same time without any circle. And then you can bring in additional items and do the same thing. Even the coincidences I gave last week do provide evidence for the Pauline authorship of 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. I just didn't happen to emphasize that. There is, as far as I know, no other channel out here doing exactly what I'm doing. It's a very specific kind of thing I'm doing. I'm bringing formal epistemology down to a lay level and applying it to apologetics and to New Testament. And I endorse videos that are done by Testify and things that Jonathan McClatchy does. They're picking up on some of what I'm doing here, and they're doing this, and the recordings of various talks that my husband Tim has given out there are doing this, but this channel is producing new content all the time and originating it where I'm the actual author of these papers and so forth, and then I'm trying explicitly to apply them to these matters, even with diagrams, and I'm doing it in a way that I'm trying to make lay friendly. I'm originating this content in a unique way, a way that's unique, and I want you to think about that when you're considering where to subscribe. Please subscribe and like, and invite your friends to do the same if they're interested in these matters, because at this channel, we're doing something special. We're making common sense rigorous.